Okay, I haven't done one of these in a while. This is an actual rant on a technical subject, actually. Um, Regarding the SolarWinds exploit, which, it's been about 6 months now, right? But supply chain attacks have been kind of been revealed either through SolarWinds or through other means. And I think they're going to become more and more common. And unfortunately, not just at my organization, but at a number, the sort of prevailing wisdom seems to be an infrastructure IT security type approach to it, which is let's prevent exfiltration of data, let's try to harden our servers, let's try to prevent passwords and other credentialing objects from being left lying around in an unprotected manner. And that's all good. The last of those especially is almost a root cause. Almost. Why I say almost is because the danger here, the real root cause, is that you're allowing malware to be deployed on your system. And there is a fairly easy way to deal with this, which is to perform real code review level malware analysis. To look at code that you're going to deploy and see whether or not it contains anything that is meant for malicious purposes. Now, I have obviously an intrinsic conflict of interest, whatever, an interest at least, in seeing that code reviews are performed as much as possible from a security standpoint, that being what I essentially do. But in many cases, you could make an argument that accidental errors can largely be caught by dynamic scanning and by pen testing, especially by gray box pen testing, where you see something and you try to prove it out, make sure that there is indeed a vulnerability there before you spend the money in trying to fix it. Now, I believe a mature organization takes a look and says, we require output encoding, or we require that non-trusted data isn't inserted directly into a SQL statement, or something along those lines. And we have in my own organization a very, what used to be a very mature way of looking at, is this a risk that you do not want to take? Now, things are moving, whatever, life always changes. But where there's more interest in, hey, is this a real vulnerability, or are you? So yeah, this is beyond this question. Let's get back to the supply chain attacks. So when you're looking at a supply chain attack, what you're looking at is some external source to code that you use, either a vendor or you're using, open source code, some kind of code that you didn't develop within your organization itself, contains a flaw. Now, a lot of that can be detected and is registered using the CVE system, Common Vulnerability Enumeration. And those are recorded. Some of them are contested, some of them are not, some of them are fixed, some of them are not. A reasonable organization will not allow CVEs to exist in software that they're deploying to their environment. Unless it's under objection, and whatever. And let's leave the political part out of it. But the point with the malicious code is that the idea is that an attacker is hitting that third-party provider for you. Well, the third-party provider is for you. They're not hitting it for you. They're hitting that third-party provider and inserting malicious code into code that you're going to deploy in your own environment or that you're going to use in some way to promote your own deployments. And in doing so, one of the threats, and the one that was most exploited in the SolarWinds attacks, is to try to exfiltrate certain very sensitive data, server passwords, stuff like that. And if that was the only possible target to this kind of supply chain attack, then yeah, locking down, using that IT solution, that network security solution, and saying, you know what, let's try to make sure that we're not sending these passwords outside of our environment. Let's flag them somehow. Let's try to detect them as they're going out, whatever. But the breadth of the potential exploit here is much, much greater than that. And while that may be an immediate patch to deal with the threat that, your various Russian bears are trying, the code words for these, cozy bear, fancy bear, whatever, for these military APT organizations are trying to exploit, well, that's what they went for. First off, that's because it's the low-hanging fruit. You shut that off, and they figure out some other way of exfiltrating the data, maybe getting it to an inside contact where it's not leaving the network, but they've got an embedded plant, a mole, if you would. There might be ways of taking that data, and I'm trying to remember the term for it, but basically hiding it within something that looks safe. You could encode it into an image in such a way that, honestly, I don't think that there's an easy way for any kind of network security solution to detect what the hell you're doing. But there is one really good, clear way to do it. Look at the shit that you're deploying at every level. You've got NPM that you're going to rely on in your environment to deploy your code. All right. Carefully comb through every NPM deploy. Do not put an uncombed through deployment into production. Do not use it while it has CVEs assigned to it. You've got known vulnerabilities on it. Okay, shut down. You can't deploy using this tool anymore. Write your own damn tools if it comes to that. And I know this is really an expensive solution in terms of if there's an exploit that's known already against one version of it, and now you've got a new version, and you've got to code review that version, you got a big problem. Now, some of that may be the open source community or the vendor's responsibility to take care of, to make sure that our code that we're putting out there has been vetted and does not contain any malicious code. Anything that's going to compromise our clients in terms of what we're putting into place. But if you can't make that assurance as a company, and for open source that's more problematic, obviously. If you can't make that assurance that you're not opening a malicious weakness, well, that is a major risk that any software development shop has to take into account. And they have to basically say, we're willing to compromise that we will give up the store to use this deployment technology, this externally developed deployment technology. And in some cases, maybe that's a reasonable assumption. And in some cases, maybe the legal protections, if you're using Microsoft tools for your deployment, or you're using some large, deep-pocketed, it has to be really deep-pocketed if your reputation is going to suffer. I mean, we could be talking about a reputation suffering to the value of your online business, and perhaps even greater than that, right? That's what you're putting at risk when you're deploying software that you did not design and did not vet into production. That's the risk that you're taking. Now, you can play with some certain multipliers and say, every deployment has maybe a 0.05 chance of risking my entire business on it. But you got to work that kind of shit into your risk model and try to figure out, is that something I can sustain? Now, for a new startup, for a small company, yeah, you got to be able to take those risks. For a global multinational, maybe not so much. Maybe you're better off saying, you know what? There's a compromise that's a known CVE, but it can be mitigated and controlled, and it's better to do that than to deploy unknown code. Now, once you've vetted the code, you have to ensure that you're putting that same code in place, and that's easily done. That can be done through hash functions to determine whether the signature is the same and all kind of stuff like that. But the real question is, what things are you going to allow in your environment to put the entire damn thing at risk? My organization has been largely untouched by these attacks so far, but I'm highly, highly worried about this situation. And when I see that other organizations that we're striving to be more like, trying to be more agile, trying to get a tighter release to the customer for any given deployment, and more reliant on accepting the use of third-party software and accepting that maybe they have pockets deep enough to handle it. And that's clearly not going to be the case with open source, right? I mean, you can't sue you can't sue the general open source software that's being put out there. You could sue an organization that's repackaging it and that provides support, etc. But those don't tend to have the kind of pockets that like an Oracle, a Google, a Microsoft have. So you're going to have to be damned careful in this sort of modern DevOps rapid deployment concept if you really are a critical industry that has to worry about the possibility that insurance companies and or the contracts that you have with your vendors are not sufficient to cover the losses that you're going to take on from the potential risks that you're taking. And that's, and then when you start looking at government agencies, where maybe the level of protection is even more clearly delineated in terms of you're seeing things, I don't remember what particular organizations were hit, but SolarWinds hit a large swath of sensitive government information. And I do not believe, from the information that I've seen at least, that the extent of it has been mapped out. I mean, when you're starting to give server credentials for interconnected systems, you're starting to really, really open the gates to the whole interconnected web of government agencies. And there, well, the most sensitive stuff maybe is put behind enough firewalls and enough network protection that information that does not come out, information that leaves the organization at any level, like even if it's going to some kind of persistent media, is checked against certain patterns to make sure that nothing at all unexpected is being written to that media. And that's really the level you have to go at. Now, I don't have familiarity, with NSA and defense protocols and controls in place. But I can tell you one thing. Eric Snowden could not have gotten the information he did, dumped where he did, if those protections were in place then. So my pessimistic guesstimate is that the kind of controls that are necessary to prevent that kind of exfiltration of data don't exist. And now, it's one thing to have an insider who has vast capabilities to access this data and maybe walk away with it. That's troublesome enough, and I'm sure that certain controls have been put in place in terms of access control rules and whatnot to help prevent something like a Snowden case from happening again. But we're always playing catch up. The key here is it's one thing, to say, yeah, we gave someone the keys to the kingdom, and that was stupid, and we won't do that again. But it's a much harder thing to say, we will inspect every bit of code that we deploy which could impact our system. And, once upon a time, I think that was actually done. The danger of leaks was actually more to do with hard copies that were printed out and that were, or handwritten stuff that was then stolen. But at this point, I'd be a hell of a lot more worried about the possibility of automated attacks of the nature of the SolarWinds attack. And there is one very clear way to detect this. It can't be done automated. It has to be done by careful examination of the source code itself. And that's it. And the question is, what is the risk appetite of a particular organization? Now, if you're talking about, sensitive intelligence data, nuclear code, stuff like that, it's way up there. But if you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar corporation, it's also fairly high. And you ought to be damned careful that you're not slipping those keys out or putting them, that they're not at risk simply because you're letting untrusted code. The same way as it would be if you hired someone without doing a background check. I mean, it's at that level, right? And it just strikes me as so easy to put some obfuscated malicious code into open source code. But it would also be very, very easy to slip the same kind of, and there, who knows how many organizations you're going to impact that use that open source code. But similarly, with any given vendor, who knows how many organizations are going to be using that vendor. The attacker probably knows because they've done a cost analysis of, is it worth trying to infiltrate this with a deep, with a deep attack that requires maybe someone being with the organization for 2 years, producing trusted, reliable content, and then slipping a little bit of obfuscated malicious code into play. And whatever you do at the network infrastructure level to try to catch the impact of what that code might be trying to do, to try to prevent what it's trying to do. Once the back door is kind of open, it's not game over, but it's pretty damn close. That can be tinkered with. That can be played with to produce different kinds of outputs, right? So unless you can detect that back door and close it, and again, it's a shell game once you get to that point. Basically, you have lost the game already. It's just a question of how long it's going to take you to find out that you lost. Because it's going to be a shell game trying to find whether or not there's an attack being made against you. Very, very innocuous seeming functionality can eventually be exploited as long as you're connected to the internet. And unfortunately, in this realm driven by Facebook and Amazon and Google of DevOps, where there isn't time to certify, yes, we know this code has not been tampered with, to sign it, and then to say, that's our deployment now. That doesn't work when you're looking at like deployments that are happening 40 or 50 times a day. So the ultimate goal of our current cycles is such, at least, at sort of the industry leaders, the ultimate goal that they're reaching towards is precisely the kind of thing that an attacker can take advantage of. And you had damn well better be sure that the software that you're using to run that shit off of, to run your changes off of, is not compromised in any way. That software should be basically treated as clean room software. And that's about all I have to say. Took a few beers to be able to get me over my hump of not doing rants of this nature. But, and I'm sure that my audience is not the right audience for this. But, yeah. I'm seeing very, very troubling patterns that have been developing over the past 15 years or so. And now they're being exploited. And it may be too late to close the door at this point. It may be too late. There are some antiquated yet highly mature development processes that have been historically resilient to this, where looking at such stuff carefully was done, even though it was expensive, just because the risk was considered too high before. But now, the risk is considered too high to not being able to do quick deployment. And, there's some point at which you're basically committing suicide as an organization. And we may find that the entirety of sort of the American infotech culture has moved in that direction already too far, and we're already compromised. And that's kind of my worry. Like, I feel like these attacks, when I see software like NPM as an example, or NuGet being attacked, I'm like, oh shit, when you start looking at these, that's the majority of the cutting edge people. And the people that the big organizations are turning to for technical help, and the way that they're aiming and trying to get towards. And I think very, very few organizations, from what I've read, really carefully vet their vendor code. And I know for a fact, as someone who has carefully vetted our organization's vendor code in the past, before we started moving to try to catch up with the rest of the world, that vendor code tends to be badly, badly vulnerable, just by accident. And the capability to insert non-accidental, malicious exploits into that vendor code or into third-party code is just stunningly revelatory. Cheers, folks. More good news from the woods.